Welcome along, and we continue our army analysis series by looking at the Scots in the High Middle Ages, and this is the Scots 1155 to 1161 AD list with the Highlander allies 1050 to 1319. It's a very interesting list. I've played against this army a few times in the league. It's quite popular. It's got a lot of unique units, which we're going to talk about, and some good infantry. So it's a pretty decent army, and we'll go through the reasons for that. Obviously, straight away you look at these large spear units. These are really the core of the army, the Scottish Spearmen. Great price, I think 54. They're heavy foot. They can form square, around 350 men. So your average units are more like 230. Yeah, around 230. A lot of your standard spear and heavy foot. So they're not for being double the size, and they're just great. You're going to get your combat strength modifier okay in the initial exchanges and at the start. There might not be that much difference when you're fighting. Say your average defensive spear. They're going to be really on evens in the melee, but as time goes on, just the size of the unit will come in and it will be a factor. And the other thing I would say is just the number that you can bring. I mean, you can bring up to 19, but you want to get some cheaper units, skirmishers and so on and so forth, and a few archers. So around this number I think works well, around 12. But 12 is, that's for a decent heavy foot. 12 of these units, that's a great advantage, really, because when I was looking at some other armies in the region, like the English or the Welsh, the Welsh armies, they only get access to the Welsh spear, which is not as good as this because it's medium foot. So they're going to be at a disadvantage in the open. The French, a lot of the European armies, they tend to have the standard defensive spear and then armored defensive spear. But again, armored defensive spear, it might have a small advantage with the armor, but as I've said before, armor doesn't tend to give you great POA advantages. So again, in the end, these kind of units are just going to grind down the smaller spear, and you're going to have an advantage there. I would also probably, if I was playing with the Scots, I'd put generals in these units, and then that would help with POA. So yes, you've got the strength modifier, which tends to kick in later as the game goes on and as the melee turns add up. But if you've got generals, then that could really help as well. So that's probably what I would do. I would probably put 2 or even 3 generals in these units, maybe 1 in mounted knights, perhaps. You've got some interesting units. You've got Highlanders. Now these are warriors, but essentially like medium foot. So in the open, they're at a disadvantage against heavy foot. If they lose the combat, they get that -1 modifier. But what's very interesting and important for these units is they are impact foot. So they've got quite an advantage on impact, and they can, they can disrupt heavy foot fairly frequently. Obviously, you just need a bit of luck, but the advantage on impact, when I was doing some tests and how I've seen them perform on the battlefield, it's, they've got around 50% chance to win against a lot of the standard defensive spear. So they're useful, and they've got bow as well. So again, like your standard defensive spear are only protected, and a lot of the armies have a lot of defensive spear. These volleys from the bow, I think it's around 12. The range is 12 to 40, so they can do a lot of damage against heavy foot that's only protected. So they are pretty good. You've got the bow. You can unleash a volley. What you can be kind of sneaky, actually. You can, if you've got any kind of defensive spear close by, you can unleash volleys of arrows at them, and then they can't really attack you, because if they do, they lose their defensive spear advantage. They only get that 100 POA if they're fighting on the defensive, if they're receiving charges. If they charge in, they lose their POA advantage. So these units can be pretty tricky to fight. Islesmen are pretty good. They're heavy foot, and they've got heavy weapons. So as I always say about heavy weapon, if they can go up against any kind of armored spear, armored units, then they negate up to 50 of the armor advantage, the POA advantage. So they're great for fighting knights and armored spear. You've even got a few offensive spearmen. Now, I don't tend to use offensive spearmen so much, and often you don't get a chance. They're not in a lot of lists, but they're just, the way it's worked out. I had some spare points, and as I was just talking about, with defensive spear, sometimes you're limited. You can't go in because you'll lose your POA advantage for being defensive spear. But obviously that doesn't happen when you're offensive spear. You've got advantage still when you attack, and that can be really helpful at crucial moments in the battle where you need to shove a unit out, gain some zone of control, stop the enemy ganging up on a unit, or whatever it might be. It just means that you can move forward and you're not penalized. So that's helpful. These Goweigen Foots, another pretty specialized unit. You don't really see them much. They're pretty good. 33, so they're really pretty cheap warriors, but they're impact foot. And when I've done some tests, and from what I've seen on the battlefield, roughly speaking, well, the advantage is 100 POA advantage against defensive spear, as an example. And that translates to, from what I've seen and what I'm seeing when I test them out, it's about a 1 in 4 chance of disrupting an enemy defensive spear unit, which is pretty good odds. It's pretty good odds. Unfortunately, if they get caught up in melee, then the table's turned, and they can often double drop, even disrupt fairly easily. But saying that, with that 100 POA advantage on impact, they can also get double drops off the enemy. So that happens as well. So they're pretty interesting, really, to use. And then you're just hoping that with the impact you're gonna get disruptions. That's what you really need. But you know, when you look at the army, when you've got these sort of plodding kind of large spear units, it's pretty cool to have some more mobile impact foot, offensive spear, Highlanders with impact and bow, you know, Islesmen with the heavy weapon. It works really well. It really does. So the backbone of the army of these kind of really large spear units, but then you've got a lot more dynamic infantry units, and infantry is absolutely everything with the Scottish. As you can see, you've got almost no cavalry. I mean, max is 3 knights. I've taken 2, so you are really limited with the cav. It's all about getting your spear into action, getting your good matchups, different ways to play. You know, I've seen players, because obviously what you've got to do with the Scots is try and, basically it's a race, isn't it? You've got to try and get your infantry engaged, your main lines engaged on the enemy, and try not to get flanked by enemy cavalry. So different ways to do it. Some players, they just make their line really wide. You know, if there's any sort of rough ground or lake or whatever it is, that can help the Scots, because really what the Scots want is a quite compressed, narrow battlefield. That's ideal for them. That's ideal. If it's a large, open plains kind of map, that's not great. So even though this rough ground, in a sense, is not so good for the heavy infantry of the Scots, it's pretty good in terms of defending against cavalry. So, yeah, you could maybe make a really wide line and then just try and hold off against the enemy. I probably tend to be a bit more compact, and I just keep maybe spearmen in reserve. You know, you need to protect your flanks as you move forwards. You don't have a lot of skirmishers either. I mean, max is 3 of the light ones, and then you just got 1 of the archers. So you're limited there as well. But you know, the Highlanders have got bows. If you wanted, you could, you know, there's 6 there. Maybe some players would take out a few more, or maybe 1 or 2 Scots spear and add Highlanders. And you know, because you don't have a lot of missile kind of troops, that would be quite useful as well. I've tended to go on you know, a little bit crazy with Scottish spear. 12, maybe you don't need 12. So at least you've got the option. If there's tons of rough ground. I mean, this map's a bit weird. You've got a stream, you've got rough ground. So maybe, you know, maybe I would actually, if I was playing on this map, maybe I'd take maybe 2 less Scots spear and add maybe 2 more Highlanders. That might work quite well. So there is actually some flexibility in your choice of units there. In terms of, you know, changing this up a little bit, if I took out, say, 2 Scots spear, I could add 2 offensive spear and 1 of these Goweigen Foot. So, you know, I've taken out 2 units and I've got an extra unit there. And I've got about, when I counted it up, I had about 19 infantry. So this takes me to 20. If you've been following my videos, armies are around, in terms of infantry, they're around 19, 20, seems to be about the average. So, you know, that's fine for infantry. Yes, you're lacking in cav. I've only got 2 knights, and a lot of armies might have 4, 5, 6, 7 cav units, depending on the army. So that as I mentioned before, that's going to be an issue with cav. You're always struggling against the cav with the Scots. But, you know, a lot of these units are spear. So when the cav does get into action, the vast majority of your infantry are spear. You know, your offensive spear, Scottish spear. Okay, you've got Highlanders and you've got these Goweigen Foot, but then, you know, vast majority of the units are spearmen, which is great for fighting cavalry. What would I give this army? About maybe a B plus. I just think that yes, even though you do struggle with your cav and fighting the enemy cav, I think maybe in medieval, cavalry maybe isn't quite as strong as in ancients, because a lot of armies, you know, with the papal list, I had 4 cav. So, you know, if I was fighting the papal list, then that army doesn't have that much cav. There's quite a few armies that are in the German imperial list. I mean, again, they're mostly all about infantry. Yeah, they might have some mounted crossbowmen, and they also have access to some sergeants, but you know, in themselves, those units are not going to turn the tide of the battle. It's going to be mainly about infantry on infantry. So I think you can get away with it. I think you can survive and prosper with mainly infantry. Yes, you're gonna suffer with the skirmishers. Haven't got any of the cheap end skirmishers, and these spearmen are protected. I think, yeah. I don't think you've really got any armoured units, and these Goweigen Foot are lightly protected, and the Highlanders are protected. So this is kind of really the way everything's set up. The units you have, you've not got that many skirmishers. Most of your units are protected or lightly protected. You just got to get going. You've got to get stuck in. This kind of army, no hanging around, just try and engage as soon as you can. But when I played the Scots, and a lot of players say, you know, it's just tough to play them when it's just infantry v infantry. They just, you know, grind you down. So many spearmen, large spearmen, good quality backup. The impact foot, 33, very cheap. Highlanders impact foot, and then offensive spear. It's just a great mix, a really great mix. So really, I think a B plus. In the hands, also you've got to, you know, I think maybe for beginners, new players, this kind of army might be a little bit more difficult to use. I think you need a bit of practice with maybe other armies, more balanced armies. You know, armies that give you a bit more cav and more skirmishers, and then you've got more leeway. You know, you can. I think it's easy to maybe make mistakes and, you know, and live and maybe even eke out a win. Whereas with this army, you know, if you don't know really what you're doing, it's easy to get bogged down. Easy just to attack in the wrong place, easy to get flanked by enemy cav if you're not sure how to stop that happening, or you know, be prepared for it. I think maybe for newer players, this list, because it's so one-dimensional, just so focused on infantry. It can be difficult to use. But once you know what you're doing, you've played the game, you've been in the league before, then I would recommend this army, because it just there's a vast array of options there in the infantry. So it can be really fun, and you know, a lot of these units you just wouldn't have used before. You know, very as I keep talking about, I want to see more and more unique units, and the Scottish lists have unique units. Goweigen Foots, Isles Highlanders, these kind of units are just really fun to use. Okay, that's about it. Let's see how they do in the league this season. You know, a lot more mobile armies with more cav. I just did, the last video was on the Syrian state army. That might be tough. That kind of army, which has more than half of its army as cavalry, and with those superior quality armored bowmen, that kind of army might be really tough, because you haven't got a lot of options in terms of chasing the cav away. Again, as I mentioned before, maybe I would take out some of these Spearmen and add Highlanders. If you could maybe, I guess if you're playing armies that you know you're going to have a fair bit of cav, you might need more Highlanders and protect them, put them in the middle of the spear, and you know, intersperse, put them something like that, and maybe I'd take a few more, and then that can really help against mounted troops, any kind of bowmen. So that might be what I would consider doing. Okay, that's about it. Thanks for watching, and we will continue the series. And I'll probably go and try and select a new army from this brand new DLC. I've done the Syrian states, so let's try another new army, and I'll post it up in the next couple of days. Okay, see you soon.